Hello there, and welcome to another in the London Luminaries lecture series. It's really good to see you. The London Luminaries is a group of 15 historic properties working together to explore the history of the West of London. And this is another of our talks on the theme of love and death. We have a whole series of talks planned for you, so do check our new website for further details. You can also watch recordings of previous talks. My name is Judith Hawley, and I'm your chair for this evening. And I'm really glad you're here. And I want to thank you for being here, but also to thank the many people behind the scenes who make these events possible. Tonight, I particularly want to thank Rachel. Now, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Dr. Hannah Mawdsley is Property Curator for the National Trust's Ham House and Garden in Richmond, London. Previously, she was Research Manager at the Imperial War Museum and Regional Property Manager for the wonderful Landmark Trust. She's presented both on radio and podcast, including BBC4's Archive on 4, Our Anniversary Obsession. She has a particular interest in cultural and social histories, women's histories, and the politics of historical memory and commemoration. Now, she tells me that last year she ran the London Marathon for the first and last time, and rather improbably, like Cupid, she is fond of archery. Over to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Judith, for hosting and for that very kind introduction. And a huge thank you, like you, Judith, to everyone behind the scenes that makes this lecture series possible. So I'm fascinated by histories and motivations of people in the past. And I think there are a few things that transcend time more than themes of love and death. So I'm delighted to be able to delve into some of these stories that relate to Ham House and the people involved in Ham's histories and collections. Today's talk will explore these stories chronologically and explore a collection that is original to Ham to shed light on the themes of love, loss, and longing. For anyone unfamiliar, this is Ham House. Originally built in 1610 and then extended in the 1670s, it's a rare 17th century survival. It contains spectacular 1630s interiors that were created by craftspeople who also worked at historic royal palaces, such as Whitehall Palace, which many of you may know burnt down in the 1690s, sadly. It also contains many pieces of art and furniture from the Restoration period under King Charles II, which in many cases can still be seen in the original rooms they were bought or designed for. For our viewers who are further afield, this is where Ham is in the world, near Richmond in southwest London. As you can see, this stretch of the Thames is peppered with a number of other wonderful historic sites, many of whom are London Luminaries members. So we'll start our story at Ham with William and Catherine Murray. In 1626, the lease of Ham was given by King Charles I to his childhood friend, Sir William Murray. William was a groom of the royal bedchamber, and his wife, Catherine, was a courtier to Charles's queen, Henrietta Maria. William and Catherine were fortunate to have the favour of the king and queen, which brought both influence and financial rewards. This allowed them to furnish Ham House with the latest fashions of interiors and artwork in the 1630s. Our first sign of love at Ham can be seen in the artwork that still adorns the walls from this time. William and Charles I shared a love for classical art, and images of Cupid, Venus, and Adonis feature in a number of paintings from this period at Ham. We know that Charles and William exchanged artworks, and William was also given permission to have copies made of paintings in the king's own collection. And today we tend to think of copies as inferior, but at that time it was a powerful sign of the king's favour if your artist had access to the king's collection to make these copies. And the copies at Ham are so good that they have even been used to help guide modern restoration work to the originals they were copied from, which includes works by Titian. A number of these copies hang on the walls of the Great Stairs at Ham House. And many of these paintings feature Cupid, son of Venus and god of love. He is shown as a winged child, sometimes with a bow and arrow. And often Cupid is not playing a main role in a painting, like this sleepy Cupid you can see in the top right image, which is a detail from a larger painting of Venus and Adonis. Rather, Cupid's presence is intended to communicate that love is a major part of the narrative being shown in the broader painting. In other paintings, however, like these copies of Caravaggio's work in the marble dining room at Ham House, Cupids are the main subject. In these overdoor paintings, they are taking a more active and playful role in the proceedings. They show Cupids engaged in various activities, including playing croquet in the top image and other games, playing with goats or with swans, playing with nymphs and satyrs, or pulling boats and nets. One of Caravaggio's designs is also mirrored in a scene in the 1630 ceiling of Ham's Green Closet, shown here at the bottom. You can see the similarities between the second and third depictions of the Cupids and Putti, basically a mirror image. The artist of the bottom image, Franz Klein, was German and was dubbed a second Titian by a 17th century contemporary, so very highly rated. Love was shown in other ways in artwork at Ham. Staying in the Green Closet, which you can see on the right for anyone who's not been able to visit, this special room is one of the earliest and most complete surviving closets in the country, containing many of its original artworks. One such piece is this wonderful miniature by Isaac Oliver. Oliver was born in Rouen, France, but moved to England at a young age with his parents. They were Huguenot refugees escaping the wars of religion. Isaac Oliver studied miniature painting, or limning, under Nicholas Hilliard, who was court limner to Queen Elizabeth I and then subsequently to King James. This particular miniature was created around about the time that Ham was first built, 1610. It portrays a man consumed by the flames of love, or perhaps religious passion. The motto above his head, if you can just make it out, is Latin, Alget qui non ardet, and it means he grows cold who does not burn, perhaps suggesting that romantic love or religious passion is essential to life. The sitter is not identified, but this striking image of burning love has hung in the Green Closet at Ham since 1677. William and Catherine collected art and decorated the interiors at Ham in royal style in the 1630s. However, this heyday was not to last. A close link with the royal family and royal favour became rather less comfortable during the Civil Wars, which ran from 1642 to 1651. By 1643, King Charles I was forced to hold his court in Oxford rather than London. William accompanied him there. In his absence, the protection of Ham was left in the capable hands of his wife Catherine and their 4 daughters, particularly their eldest daughter and heir, Elizabeth. This miniature on the right of Catherine in an ebony travelling case still hangs in the private closet at Ham House. The 1679 inventory records that in this room hung one picture of Her Grace's mother in an ebony case. Created using watercolour on vellum and dating to 1638, this portrait may have been taken to the Oxford court by William as a reminder of his beloved wife. In the 1670s, their daughter Elizabeth kept this image of her much-loved mother close and on display in her most private room. And in Elizabeth's next room, the White Closet, a bronze bust of Catherine sits above the mantelpiece, where it has stood since 1677. Attributed to the Anglo-French sculptor Peter Besnier, it has been described by sculpture specialist Jeremy Warren as one of the finest sculptures to survive from the period before the English Civil War, representing the highest level of portraiture in bronze in Britain at this time. These careful and high-quality representations of Catherine really underline the love between her and William and between her and Elizabeth. This bond between mother and daughter was further illustrated by the fact that in 1648, when Catherine was in poor health, she transferred the stewardship of Ham to Elizabeth, with faith that her eldest daughter would be able to love and protect Ham as she had. Catherine died the following year, in 1649, and was buried at the local church in Petersham in the family vault. This memorial plate records her death, some 7 months after the death of her King Charles I. The memorial plaque records that Catherine's funeral was celebrated with all fitting solemnity, according to her degree. With her mother dead, her father William still in exile, and King Charles I executed, Elizabeth's hold on Ham was vulnerable. Fortunately, Elizabeth's first marriage to Sir Lionel Talmash seems to have been a really successful partnership. Lionel's efforts, finances, and apparent political neutrality were key in supporting Elizabeth's efforts to keep hold of Ham during the Civil Wars. This portrait on the left, by one of the earliest documented female painters in the country, Joan Carlyle, was completed soon after their marriage in 1648 and shows Elizabeth in the centre, flanked by Lionel on the left and her sister Margaret on the right. The portrait on the right also dates to the same time, around 1648. In the late 1660s, when Lionel was nearing the end of his life, he wrote to his son with advice on love and marriage. He advised him to love her entirely, but let her not know it, for all wives are but too apt to take advantage of the fondness of their husband, and upon it to grow insolent and imperious, and inclined to pervert the laws of nature by endeavouring a superiority over the husband. And if she gets the reins in her own hands, away she will run with it. You scarce ever will stop her in the whole course of her life. I personally think that means Elizabeth got her own way during their marriage. Lionel died in 1669, and 3 years after his death, in 1672, Elizabeth married the second Earl of Lauderdale, John Maitland. These two seem to have a long-held affection for one another. In 1670, Lauderdale had amended his will before his marriage to Elizabeth, in recognition of some act of Elizabeth's while he was imprisoned in the Tower of London during the Civil Wars. We don't know the full details, but it was a sizable bequest of £1,500 sterling in gold. The will stated that this was in gratitude for the pains and charges she was at in preserving my life when I was a prisoner in the year 1651. After Lauderdale's first wife died in 1671, he was encouraged by friends to marry a younger woman because he lacked a direct heir. However, he and Elizabeth seem to have shared a mutual respect, affection, and love that made him disregard that advice. He married Elizabeth, then 46 years of age, within 3 months of his wife's death. This portrait on the left by Sir Peter Lely, the court painter, was likely painted as a wedding portrait of the couple. Maitland was a member of Charles II's inner circle of ministers, often referred to as the Cabal, and the new couple received royal patronage. They were made Duchess and Duke of Lauderdale a few months after their marriage in May 1672, and Maitland was made a Knight of the Garter the following month. The Order of the Garter is the most senior order of knighthood in the country, with a very limited membership, so this underlines the power and respect he commanded at this time. This portrait of the Duke in his garter robes was also painted by Sir Peter Lely and hangs in Ham's Long Gallery. Like Lionel, Elizabeth's first husband, Maitland supported Elizabeth's love for Ham and her family's legacy. The year before their marriage, Lauderdale seems to have secured the freehold of the manors of Ham and Petersham, something that William, Catherine, and Elizabeth had all strived for, but not managed to achieve. Lacking the freehold had meant that the family's hold on Ham was vulnerable. Was this a romantic gesture by Maitland, anticipating his and Elizabeth's marriage the following year? Or was it a request from Elizabeth to secure the freehold against the whims of future monarchs? Either way, it ensured that Elizabeth and her Talmash heirs could secure Ham for posterity. Elizabeth and John became the ultimate power couple, but were not always the most popular. In 1672, shortly after their wedding, they travelled to Scotland to open Parliament on behalf of the King. Women did not customarily attend this ceremony, but the newly married Lauderdale not only had Elizabeth accompany him, but Elizabeth also, and I quote, called for chairs for herself and her ladies and remained seated throughout the Duke's speech from the throne. This, of course, scandalised the Scottish nobility in attendance and the local Scots in Edinburgh. As befitted their social status, the Duchess and Duke set about renovating and extending their houses in both England and Scotland. This included Ham, where Elizabeth had already begun investing in repairs and renovations before their marriage. The house was extended towards the south, as seen here in a view painted by Hendrik Dankerts around 1675. The Duchess and Duke are shown in front of their enlarged house, surrounded by impressed acquaintances and obsequious subordinates. The extension included a new suite of rooms and furnishings created especially for Charles II's Queen, Catherine of Braganza, on the first floor. One of these rooms, the Queen's Closet, included ceiling paintings by Italian muralist Antonio Verrio. And here we see more Cupids showering the Queen in the room below with flowers. Verrio became very popular in the late 17th century and was later commissioned to create spectacular ceilings at royal residences, including Windsor Castle and Hampton Court Palace. When commissioning Verrio to paint the Queen's Closet ceiling, Elizabeth also commissioned him to paint ceilings in her own special rooms, the private closet and the White Closet. The ceiling on the right, in the White Closet, depicts divine wisdom presiding over the liberal arts, with plenty of cupids and putti thrown into the design. The ceiling on the left, however, is particularly interesting. This ceiling, in the private closet, depicts the penitent Magdalene, surrounded by cupids who hold symbols of time, death, and eternity. An hourglass, held by this cupid, a skull, held by this cupid, and the Ouroboros, or the self-eating snake, a symbol of eternity. So we have life, death, and rebirth in this ceiling. Lauderdale died in 1682, and after being embalmed, his body was brought to the chapel at Ham House. Surprisingly, only after several weeks was it taken to Scotland for burial. A sermon was preached for Elizabeth in the chapel at Ham after his burial in Scotland. And as is often the case with eulogies, the sermon is highly complimentary, which casts a rather different angle on an individual who seems to have provoked a lot less complimentary comments during his living years. For example, the sermon praises the Duke's great and generous spirit that was always focused on the public good. The likely biased sermon giver was the late Duke's chaplain, John Gaskarth, who attempts to reconcile this disparity. He wrote, "This, I am persuaded, was one great reason why so many were dissatisfied with his proceedings and turned adversaries to him, because he understood better than they, and would have forced them into their own good, which they apprehended not." After the Duke's death in 1682, Elizabeth spent much of the rest of her life in straitened circumstances. These financial problems included debts for substantial investments in both Ham and Scottish properties, like Thurleston Castle, but also costly disputes over the Duke's will with his brother. The loss affected Elizabeth emotionally as well as financially, though. After Lauderdale's death, for example, Elizabeth appears to have changed all of the pictures in her bedchamber, perhaps as a consequence of her loss. At least after the Duke's death, Elizabeth still had her children. Elizabeth's love for her family, Ham, and its legacy was steadfast, and that was nowhere clearer than for her offspring. Together, Elizabeth and her first husband, Lionel, had 11 children. However, the couple experienced loss since only 5 survived to adulthood, and several of Elizabeth's adult children predeceased her. Her eldest son, shown on the left here, Lionel, was her heir and did survive her. He became the 3rd Earl of Dysart on her death in 1698. Sadly, 2 of her adult sons died as adults. Her second son, Thomas, in the middle here, was a lieutenant general and garnered great acclaim through serving in 17 campaigns. In 1694, he was wounded while leading an attack on Brest in Brittany. He died on the journey home from gangrene and was buried at Helmingham Hall, the Tolmash seat in Suffolk. Elizabeth and Lionel's 3rd son, William, who's not pictured here, was considered a bit of a black sheep of the family. While living in Paris with a tutor to further his education, he quarrelled with a gentleman called William Carnegie and killed him in a dramatic duel. This, as you might imagine, got him into some rather hot water. Elizabeth dispatched her trusted cousin, Mrs. Henderson, and William's elder brother, Thomas, who managed to negotiate his release from imprisonment and potentially execution, paying a large fine to the dead man's father, Lord Carnegie. Later, in Barbados, William quarrelled with the purser of HMS Diamond and killed him during a fight. He was found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the hand. Probably despairing of him at this point, but with a mother's love knowing no bounds, Elizabeth bought him a commission in the Navy, and he headed for the West Indies. In 1694, she received word that he had sadly died of fever at St. Christopher. There are other children that are slightly more obscured in the records. We do have receipts for keeping an Edward Tollemache in Bethlehem Hospital, which was an asylum colloquially known as Bedlam, between 1652 and 1654, and for his burial in December 1654. Elizabeth's eldest surviving daughter, born in 1659, was also called Elizabeth, but known as Betty, and she's pictured here on the right. Betty married Archibald Campbell, 1st Duke of Argyll, and lived in Scotland. She and her mother corresponded by letter, though apparently not as much as Elizabeth hoped. In September 1694, 4 years before her death, Elizabeth wrote to Betty. The first section seems to express her disinterest in Betty's private affairs. Instead, Elizabeth wants the political gossip from Scotland directly from her daughter, rather than having to receive it secondhand from other people in Surrey. My dearest child, she wrote, there are so many particulars daily informed from Scotland upon general subjects, both what is doing there and what persons are moving, coming and going at this time and season, that I'm not believed when I say I have no account from you, nor indeed do I readily credit the daily news which is told me, because all your letters have been only your own concerns. She goes on to say, there are several persons in this parts whose friends do frequently write to them from Scotland, and whose interests are very considerable there and managed here with the greatest discretion. Her next section bemoans her lack of movement and ability to travel, to keep track of events as she used to, as by this time Elizabeth is suffering with gout and is limited to the ground floor of the house at Ham. I have never yet been farther than this low story, except when I was had up to the highest to close old Rebecca's dying eyes. Rebecca was a servant who had been with Elizabeth for many years. The servant slept in the attic, so Elizabeth had climbed the stairs to perform this act on Rebecca's death. Elizabeth then goes on to state, rather unconvincingly, I believe, that she is done with political involvement and that her priority had only ever been to secure the happiness of her children. Classic parental guilt trip. I am entirely discouraged from all future meddling in the world, having now had the full and sad experience of my unsuccessfulness in my whole and only design, which has been to preserve my legal rights for the good and happiness of all my children. The deaths of her sons, both in 1694, clearly weighed heavily on Elizabeth, as well as the financially straitened time that she found herself in the last years of her life. She goes on to say, I have now lost my 2 only youngest sons, and all my movable estate is sold, even to the disfurnishing of this, my dwelling house, still stopping to complete all your happinesses at the last. And now what can I, or what must I further do? I leave you to judge how loaded my heart is with grief to be in such a condition as I have brought myself to, and at this time to be utterly unable to come to your relief and service. Elizabeth died aged 72 on the 5th of June, 1698 at Ham House. She was buried with her mother and other family members at the local church in Petersham. The 18th century brings more stories of love, loss, and longing to Ham House. In 1729, Elizabeth's great-grandson Lionel, the 4th Earl of Dysart, married Grace Carteret, daughter of John, Lord Carteret. And this is the time when a curious pair of hair earrings arrived at Ham. An envelope with a handwritten provenance in the archives at Ham explains how and why they arrived. The hair was reputed to be that of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, whose failed coup against Queen Elizabeth I had resulted in his execution. The top left image on the slide is an image which might be Robert Devereux, which is in the Green Closet at Ham House. Robert's daughter, Frances, was said to have kept locks of his hair as a reminder of her deceased father, and a portrait of at the National Trust Place Newydd shows her wearing this hair as an earring. So how did these earrings end up at Ham House? Francis's great-great-granddaughter, Frances Worsley, married John Lord Carteret, 2nd Earl of Granville. Their daughter Grace, the lady on the right here, became Countess of Dysart on her marriage to Elizabeth's grandson Lionel in the second right portrait. The earrings had passed down in the female line from Frances to Grace through 5 generations. They were clearly treasured possessions in loving memory of Frances's deceased father. Perhaps somewhat ironically, the earrings of Robert Devereux's hair are displayed in the green closet on either side of an exquisite miniature by Nicholas Hilliard, which is of Queen Elizabeth I, the focus of Devereux's failed coup. Grace and Lionel's son, another Lionel, succeeded his father to become 5th Earl of Dysart in 1770. His first wife was Charlotte Walpole, illegitimate daughter of Sir Edward Walpole and niece to prolific letter writer and social commentator Horace Walpole, who lived across the river at Strawberry Hill House. And Charlotte doesn't appear to have been particularly enthused about the marriage, but at the grand old age of 22 was worried that she was going to be left on the shelf. She wrote, "If I had been but 19, I would have refused him, point blank. I do not like to be married in a week to a man I never saw. But I am 22. Some people say I am handsome, some say I am not. I believe the truth is that I'm likely to be large and go off soon. It's dangerous to refuse so great a match." Their marriage is not reputed to have been a good one. However, Elizabeth developed a long, painful illness 10 years after their marriage in 1780 and eventually died in 1789. She and Lionel had no children, but this mourning ring was possibly commissioned by her husband. It contains woven locks of Charlotte's hair with an inscription on the back which says Countess of Dysart, 5th of September 1789, and inscribed around the front the words, "Forgive the wish that would have kept thee here." Perhaps a sad reference to her painful illness and the fact that, with her death, she was no longer in pain. The 5th Earl married twice, but didn't have any children, so the title passed to his younger brother Wilbraham, who became 6th Earl of Dysart in 1799. The portrait in the middle here shows him as a young boy, playing a predecessor of badminton called battledore and shuttlecock. The 6th Earl, Wilbraham's marriage, in contrast, seems to have been an enviable one. He had married Anna Maria Lewis in 1773, whom he adored. They clearly loved Ham House as much as Wilbraham's great-great-grandmother Elizabeth had. They made many improvements and repairs, including opening up Ham to the view of the river by removing part of the front garden wall. They were also keen patrons of the arts and installed a new ornamental dairy for Anna Maria. You can see this in the right-hand picture with these extraordinary cow-shaped table legs. However, just 5 years after they took Ham House on, Anna Maria died at Ham in 1804, aged just 59. This memorial miniature on the left by Henry Bone carries an inscription marking her passing. Wilbraham was so heartbroken by her death that he could not bear to live at Ham for many years afterwards. Wilbraham also died childless, so the earldom and Ham House was inherited by his sister, Louisa, who became the 7th Countess of Dysart, aged 76. So the more I learn about Louisa, the more of a heroine she becomes to me. Louisa had married John Manners in 1765, but it wasn't just a normal marriage, it was an elopement. Legend has it that she eloped through a gate in the garden wall at Ham, locking it behind her and throwing the key back over the wall so that she wouldn't change her mind. Louisa enjoyed her time as Countess of Dysart at Ham House. She was reputedly a keen dog owner and loved her dogs more than her guests, who were often bitten by them. She seems to have been more worried about whether the dogs would get ill from biting the humans than about the bitten humans themselves. She also loved sleep, apparently not rising each day until 4 in the afternoon. She was also a keen art lover and a patron of John Constable, who visited Ham many times. She seems to have developed a close friendship with him and his family. These portraits are both by Constable and hang in the Great Hall at Ham. Constable wrote about his visits, which demonstrate the intimacy that he and his family had at Ham during Louisa's time. He recorded his portrait work for her, their long, intimate conversations, and the close relationship that he and his family enjoyed with the Countess. The last Tolmash inhabitant of Ham House was Sir Lionel Tolmash, who came to Ham in 1935, aged 81 years old. The enduring family love for Ham House was demonstrated by the gift of the property to the National Trust in 1948, so that it could be looked after for centuries to come. Bringing us to a close and up to date, and finishing on the theme of love, the house, collection and garden at Ham are now loved and cared for by the staff, volunteers and supporters of the National Trust, and by the visitors that we welcome every year, whose support enables us to look after this special place for the long term. We look forward to welcoming you to Ham House and Garden soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that absolutely wonderful talk. I want to, before we open up for questions, and I'm sure there will be some questions. I've had one or two good ones already. I just want to point out the other talks in the series, which develop this theme of love and death that you've developed so richly. And you've also particularly stressed the sort of the material culture element, and I'm sure that's going to come out in other talks. We've already had an excellent talk by Clive Francis on Garrick's Temple. And next week we have Angela Platt on Boston Manor, and James Wisdom on Gunnersbury Park on an amazing funeral. That's one I really want to listen to in full. We have the following week Katie Hinchcliffe on Hogarth and his amazing images, and then Alexis Haslam on Fulham Palace. And then we have an extra kind of a tail end Charlie in November, where we have a double act from Kew Palace and Strawberry Hill House and Gardens.